Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute or two, give everyone a chance to log on. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Lake Champlain Chamber's first virtual legislative breakfast. I'm Lisa Kingsbury, Chair of the Chamber's Board of Directors, and I want to welcome you here on this somewhat gloomy October morning. Hope you're all doing well and staying safe and staying healthy. Certainly wish we could all be together today, but it's also okay to stay indoors and stay warm on this day. Before we get started, on behalf of the board, I just want to take a minute to thank the Chamber staff for all of the hard work and dedication that they have given to the job over this past 7 months. Like many of you, they are continuing to work from home, and they've all just done an amazing job of keeping things going at the Chamber, supporting our members and their businesses, pivoting our programs like Leadership Champlain and Launch VT into digital formats. And as you'll hear later from Austin, continuing to advocate on all of our behalfs with a legislature that has gone digital, which is not an easy task, I'm sure. I continue to be impressed every day with their creativity and dedication. Please reach out to the staff if you need any support. They're here to help us. And with that, I'd like to thank our sponsor for this morning, New England Federal Credit Union, and would also like to thank Costco for continuing to host our breakfast even after it went digitally and doing it in a way that supports our small businesses. And with that, we're going to get started. I'm going to turn it over to John Dwyer from our sponsor, New England Federal Credit Union. John has been with New England Federal Credit Union for almost 30 years, currently serves as the president and CEO, and he is a former chair of our Chamber's Board of Directors. Welcome, John.
Thanks very much, Lisa, and good morning to everybody. As Lisa said, it's a little gloomy this morning and a little different than our normal format, but the New England Federal Credit Union is proud of supporting this opportunity for chamber members to engage with our elected officials. Although our experience will be different for now, most of you have attended previous breakfasts where the access we Vermonters enjoy to our state officials is on full display. I have had the privilege of being at the podium and coordinating your questions, and I suspect we all look forward to that opportunity again. So thank you. And it is now my pleasure to actually introduce a couple of videos for you. We have, because of all of the activity in Washington, we are unable to have our national elected officials with us. So we have two video messages from Senator Patrick Leahy and Congressman Peter Welch. So we will kick those off now. Welcome again.
And of course, now we're in a hearing for the least accessible Supreme Court hearing in history. This is not normal times, and it's unfortunate for the country and for all of us. But I also look at what you've done, and I'm proud of you. The year has been one that's put us all to the test. Our families, our communities, institutions, our businesses have all been challenged. But we Vermonters have risen to the occasion in a way that should make all of us proud, but it's an example to the rest of the country. We have the nation with the lowest prevalence of COVID. We prove that we followed science and common sense. So when we do that, it ensures the safety of all our communities, of all our people. But it's also meant sacrifice and loss for us in Vermont. Every day I hear from Vermonters whose lives have been upended by the pandemic. Many of them are neighbors, and many of them are people Marcel and I have known for years. We hear from restaurants and lodging, cultural organizations. They've all been heavily hit. We have tens of thousands of Vermonters from these industries. They're out of work. They're struggling to make ends meet. And the calls and notes and all I get from them are heartbreaking. Now, some visitors from other states, neighboring states, have safely traveled to Vermont. And you can't blame them. We have a fall foliage season that can't be matched anywhere else in the world. But our tourism sector still has a long way to go to recover. At times this year, I know a lot of us have said, when are things going to be back to normal? And we probably ask, what's Vermont going to look like when the pandemic is over? We don't know the answers to all these questions, but we have a role to play, all of us on this call, to get it back. We can think of our favorite shop probably on Church Street, or the restaurant in a community that's sort of a cornerstone for everybody. The artists who have captured the essence of Vermont. I could go into dozens, hundreds of examples. And we know the holiday season is just around the corner. What is that going to mean for our Vermont businesses and all Vermonters? So we, as individuals, we could put our own wallets together to promote a strong Vermont, but that's not going to be enough. We need Congress to act. I can tell you, I know you're going to do your part, and you know I'm going to do mine. In March, I bought, like Matt, I spent actually with my staff 7 days a week working on including a number of provisions in the CARES Act. We did that to help health and economic and financial impacts in our pandemic. Now, some of these provisions, the Paycheck Protection Program, the fact we are able to use the Leahy small state minimum and brought $1.25 billion in coronavirus relief funds to Vermont, that's offered some support, but it's not enough in Vermont. Now, we passed that CARES Act, 7 months ago, but we know even as we worked with it, more help is needed. This virus is still spreading throughout the country. It's been frustrating that Senator McConnell, who has the control of what goes on the floor of the Senate, has refused to bring another coronavirus act before the Senate, even though the House of Representatives passed one months ago. He has somehow found a time, even during the pandemic, even during a time when the Senate is closed down because of the spread of the virus, to try to ram through another Supreme Court nominee. I said, that could wait. There's no urgency for that, but there is an urgency for relief for all of us. That's not a Republican or Democratic idea. That's an American idea. When the virus comes around, it doesn't ask what your political party is. You and your family ask, are we going to survive this? And if you have a business, you ask yourself, are we going to be able to reopen? So we have to rise to meet this. I'm hoping the Senate will stop playing politics. Let's get together. I think that there are enough Republicans and Democrats that can join together with a real bill that will help us in Vermont and importantly, help the whole country. I'm going to keep fighting for that. Just as I was able to get the Leahy small state minimum in for Vermont before, I'll keep fighting to have that in an upcoming bill. We're in this all together. I don't care what political party somebody might belong to. We Vermonters care about each other. Marcel and I are lifelong Vermonters. We keep all our fellow Vermonters in our prayers and our thoughts. And darn it, I want the Congress to act because we need more than just prayers and thoughts. We need the help the federal government should be sending to Vermont. Thank you for what you do. I know most of you personally. Don't hesitate to call me or email me. Let me know what your thoughts are. Be well.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you at the Lake Champlain Regional Chamber. I want to express to you my gratitude and all that you are doing to help Vermonters get through this incredible challenge. What we're facing is two challenges. First, healthcare. We have a once-in-a-century pandemic. The last time America faced a crisis like COVID was in 1918. We've got to keep ourselves safe. And number two, we have the economic challenge that is the collateral consequence of COVID. Let me talk first about healthcare. I'm pretty proud, very proud really of Vermont and the leadership we've had from the governor's office and our health department on focusing Vermonters on doing the things that'll keep us safe. With wearing masks, social distancing, washing our hands. Vermont has the lowest infection rate in the country, and thank goodness we do. we've lost in this country 210,000 lives and increasing, and well over 7 million people who've been infected. We've got to continue to help each other by taking those precautions that keep all of us safe. But second, we have this incredible economic consequence that is directly the result of doing the things we need to do to keep safe. We've had to close many businesses. We had to close our schools, and we're now slowly reopening. But the bottom line here is that if we're going to get through this and the economic consequences that are affecting small businesses, families, and our state and local governments, we must have the enthusiastic and sustained support of the federal government. That government belongs to you, and it is the backstop when there is an emergency that affects every state, every American. It is the only governmental entity that has the fiscal flexibility and the fiscal capacity to provide aid that is really needed. You know, that first round of aid that was back in March, $2.2 trillion, negotiated by Speaker Pelosi and Senate Leader McConnell, made a huge difference. It provided payroll protection money to small businesses so they could keep folks on board. It provided money to the state of Vermont. It provided help for folks who were unemployed, including independent contractors that normally would not be eligible for unemployment. It kept us afloat. But now we're seeing, as the fall season is here, the infection rate is going up, and the economic relief that had been provided is starting to expire. I believe the federal government has to continue in providing relief, both to the states and to businesses and to individuals. Chairman Powell of the Federal Reserve is doing, in my view, a very great job on monetary policy. He's kept the economy afloat with the Fed policies. But what he has said is what I believe, and that is that Congress and the president should be cooperating to provide fiscal relief. What Chairman Powell says is that two have to work together. And it's why I am working so hard in an effort to get another economic package, something we passed in Congress but can't finally get an agreement with the Senate and the president on, that would continue relief to small businesses, that would provide substantial funding for state and local governments whose revenues have collapsed, and aid to individuals. You know, we can get through this, and we will. But my big apprehension is that when we get that vaccine and get to the other side of COVID, we've left behind many of these wonderful businesses that are so essential to the quality of community life in our Vermont towns and cities, our restaurants, our performance spaces, our nonprofits. We've got to make sure that we can help them enough so that they can hang on and be there with us when we get to the other side of COVID. And it's why I'm the sponsor of the Restaurants Act to provide aid to them, and I'm sponsored the Save Our Stage Act, which would help our performance spaces and our nonprofits. So thank you for what you're doing. Please hang in. We all have to help one another get to the other side. But as one of your representatives in Congress, I'm working with Bernie and Patrick to do every single thing we can to provide the financial assistance, the lifeline support that is necessary so that we can bounce back strong when we are healthy and safe. Thank you very much for all you do. I want to be your partner in the renewal of Vermont.
Thank you to our congressional delegation for sending those messages through. Now we're going to move into a discussion between Lake Champlain Chamber's Government Affairs Manager, Austin Davis, and Emily Mandel from Moody's Analytics. Emily Mandel is an economist at Moody's Analytics, where she conducts government consulting and regional economic research with an emphasis on state and local government finance and the municipal bond market. In this role, she oversees various economic forecasts and works closely with a number of governments in an advisory role. Emily's most recent research has focused on modeling the budgetary shortfalls states will face as a result of the current economic crisis. She's also done research modeling the financial and economic drivers of municipal creditworthiness. In addition, Emily has worked with several state and local governments to develop forecasts of major tax revenue streams. Emily earned an MA in International and Development Economics from Yale University and holds undergraduate degrees in Economics and International Studies from Dickinson College. Welcome, Emily.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here today, virtually with all of you, to talk with you today. Of course, I'd rather be up in Vermont, but unfortunately that'll have to wait until after the pandemic. What I'm hoping to give you today through this talk is some broader context about our outlook for the economy. And I specifically want to focus in on some of our assumptions at Moody's Analytics about fiscal stimulus and the stress, particularly that state and local governments are facing in the recovery. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. So before I get going on this, I always like to give this disclaimer that while I work for Moody's Analytics and we're part of Moody's Corporation, we're actually a completely different entity than Moody's Investor Service, the bond rating agency. So for that reason, nothing that I say here today should at all be interpreted as having any implications for credit ratings. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now that that's out of the way, with this chart here, I'd just like to situate us within the recovery and give a sense of where we're going from here. So this is a graph of real GDP, and this includes both the history of, you can see that massive drop there, as well as our forecast for the next year. So while we've passed through the recession phase of the business cycle, and that's marked here in orange, so that phase really stretched back through the end of February through April, and it encompassed that really stressful time when states were rushing to close non-essential businesses. The layoffs were spiking, the unemployment rate was just rising massively as public health agencies really tried to curb that initial spread of the virus. So then that's been followed by the blue bar here, which is the reopening phase. And that period gave us just a really strong rebound in activity as businesses were hiring back workers that they had temporarily laid off or furloughed and resuming operations. Now you can see though that that really only got us part of the way back to where we were before. And businesses are still, I'm sure all of you are well aware that businesses are still operating with many restrictions, limitations, and some industries have just really been unable to come back to anywhere near normal because this pandemic is still a major force in our lives. So after we've moved past that strong initial bounce, the recovery has really slowed. And that's shown here in the purple bar, which is we've labeled it the pre-vaccine recovery. And we're really just at the start of this. So still got some time to go, unfortunately. Especially as cases have remained as high as they have, the real limitations of how far we can go with this near-term recovery have come into relief. Especially the industries severely disrupted when the pandemic hit, areas like hospitality, retail, restaurants, recreational activities. They're hiring back, but they're hiring back at a much slower pace. And this has become even more apparent in recent weeks with the announcements of just massive layoffs at the airlines and Disney. So this orange bar, the GDP during this purple phase is quite slow. The growth is quite slow, and it's going to continue that way until we get a vaccine that's widely distributed. Our forecast pegs us at May 2021. Obviously, we're economists. We're not epidemiologists. We're not doctors here. So this could shift somewhat, hopefully earlier, perhaps later. But at that point, we'll get some pent-up demand flowing into the economy, and businesses will hopefully be able to return to operations at full capacity. That said, a full recovery will take more time than this. It's not going to bounce back right away because a lot of small businesses have unfortunately already been forced to close for good. People have been put out of the labor market, perhaps to as we switch to remote schooling, things like that, and it'll take time to go back into the labor market even after economic activity begins to recover more. Okay, next slide, please. Thanks. So this chart here shows what I find a kind of nifty measure that we put together to measure the economy's progress back to, quote, normal. And we define normal here as activity at the end of February. And so that's marked here as 100. And so any value below 100 shows how far below normal, essentially, the economy is operating. And now this isn't just your classic economic indicators. This index pulls together nearly 40 public and private indicators of activity. And those range from seated diners through open table data, Google mobility data, which shows how far are people like moving from their homes to go about maybe their normal day-to-day activities, TSA screenings to give a sense of how travel is picked up. And then also, of course, the economic data that we love, such as business sentiment, hours work, unemployment claims, high frequency estimates of GDP, things like that. And so using this, we can measure how far this index has climbed back to pre-pandemic normal. So you can see here from the blue line that the US economy is operating at just 80%. So this places us 20% below where it was prior to when the pandemic struck in March and things just shut down. This is up, however, you can see definite progress there. It's up 60 from minimum of around 60%. Now, I'm not going to focus on Vermont in this presentation. Austin will have much more to say about that after. But I've added this green line here in for comparison's sake. And that's Vermont's back to normal index, essentially. And you can see that Vermont's a bit closer to recovery here. I believe it's helped by Vermont has a low infection rate, and it could potentially even be helped by some people who are perhaps working out of or living out of vacation homes where they normally wouldn't be in the state. If you're interested in seeing how any other states are faring, or perhaps watching how this index evolves in coming months, you can check that out at CNN.com. It's a joint venture between CNN Business and Moody's Analytics, and just search for the back to normal index. I think it should actually be pretty interesting, especially as we move through into the winter when things might need to start shutting down again. I mean, I don't think people are going to be doing outdoor dining in Vermont in February, say. So we can see how the economy is faring and what kind of, whether we end up backtracking or whether we're able to keep pushing on with this progress. The main takeaway, though, that I want from this line, especially this blue bar here below, is that progress has really slowed sharply over the past 2 months. We've been around 80% 2 months ago, and we're still around 80%. And I want to talk a bit about some of the reasons for this. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So part of and a major reason why this progress has slowed is because the amount of federal stimulus flowing into the economy has really tapered off. So this bar here you can see is a cumulative total of the direct relief funds flowing from the federal government. And so you can see these bars really jumped up in particularly where we start April here, as the government responded impressively quickly, honestly, to quickly channel a huge amount of money into the economy. Combine that with some pretty assertive moves by the Fed to lower interest rates and give some pretty definitive guidance around that. And this really propped up consumer spending. It helped support confidence. And we believe that it really prevented a worse recession here and helped us bounce back to normal. You can see there's a few major sources of funds that I've outlined here. The biggest among these is the Paycheck Protection Program. And that helped businesses to keep workers on the payrolls. Then next, the green bar above that is economic impact payments. And those were those $1,200 direct payments that many people got, and that just allowed consumers to perhaps spend more than they would have normally as they eye this just historic drop and recession. And then another one I want to outline is that gray bar, and now that kicked in a little bit later as states rushed to update their systems and things, but those were the extra $600 in weekly unemployment insurance. And that was another really key part of that, because many workers who were suddenly out of work, this wasn't the type of economy there where they could go and be like, okay, let me find another employer that's hiring, because so much of activity was just shut down really in an unprecedented way. Unfortunately, those payments were then replaced by some $300 payments, but that's essentially now ended. There's a few more weeks in some states, but that money is really gone, and they're back to just receiving normal unemployment benefits. We had really been betting on another round of federal stimulus being passed before the election. You can see here that it's been, 6-7 months since we've really had new infusions of cash into the economy, and the pandemic is still such a reality for all of us. But that seems really unlikely now that we'll get a bill passed, given everything that's going on in Washington, D.C. right now. Our October forecast, we update our forecast monthly. So our October forecast, which we actually just went live last night, we for the first time stripped out that assumption of new funding coming into the economy. And we're now assuming that a major stimulus package doesn't get passed until February of next year. I can go into more detail about what kind of stimulus we'd expect in this, and potentially like what kind of scenarios could play out regarding this in the Q&A if anyone's interested. Okay, next slide, please. Thanks. So I'm going to shift course a little bit now and focus in on one of the main sources of stimulus that we think is really crucial to the recovery, and that's direct aid to state and local governments. States have really seen their revenues hammered by the pandemic, and there are also certain expenses that always rise during recessions. And so they're having to grapple with those too. I'm going to attempt to quantify those in a second, but first to give a framework of how I approach the potential outlook future of the economy is we always look at it through the lens of different scenarios based on different assumptions. So there's two main scenarios that I like to focus on. First and foremost, of course, is the baseline, and this is the future that we think is just most probable. These are our best guess about how things are going to play out. In this case, since March, since February, the course of the economy has really become linked to the course of the pandemic. We've done some work showing about how as cases rise, that correlates to an increase in unemployment, it correlates to things shutting down again. And so we include some epidemiological assumptions when we're constructing a forecast. So in this case, we assume that the pandemic was really at its worst, requiring the worst shutdowns during the summer. Now, this is a little bit tenuous, especially with some of the case numbers we've seen going up recently. But even under this scenario where we're past the worst of it, the economy doesn't fully recover until late 2023. So now that risks, like I mentioned, risks to the outlook are quite high right now, it's also really important to consider a downside scenario. And so here I've highlighted a severe stress scenario. We call it S3. And in it, we account for a second round of outbreaks and a double dip recession really starting at the end of the year. I have a chart of what GDP, for example, would look like, which I'll show you a little bit later under this downside, so you can see how it compares and potentially how the economy could go south a little bit from where it is even now. So in this worst scenario, this S3 scenario, it's not until 2027 that we recover the previous number of jobs that we had prior to this pandemic. So quite a slow recovery there. So of course, we have upside scenarios. We have tons of scenarios, but I think the baseline between 2023 to 2027 in our downside is a fair range of what we could see in terms of recovery. Okay, next slide, please. Thanks. So like I mentioned, states are under really unprecedented fiscal stress as a result of the pandemic. There are two main areas that we account for when we're estimating shortfalls states are facing. And these are revenue losses and increased expenditures, here particularly on Medicaid. So states are facing lost revenue for many reasons. People are out of work, so they might not be paying as much in income taxes. States, especially that rely on tourism, aren't getting as many visitors, which is then impacting particular taxes related to visitors. And then both visitors and residents alike are potentially not spending as much. Or spending different ways. And so this is reducing how much revenue can be captured through sales taxes. So the annual values that we expect state revenues to come in below potentially what they would have been absent a pandemic, those are reflected in these blue bars here up above for 2020, 2021, and fiscal 2020, 2021, and 2022. But that's only half of the equation, right? On the other hand, some of the automatic stabilizers that kick in during recessions can also increase states' costs. The most expensive one of these is Medicaid, so that's what we've accounted for here, and those are the green bars. With Medicaid, costs tend to rise with unemployment as more people go onto the Medicaid rolls. There's some other examples of expenditures that'll increase in a recession, things like food stamps or welfare benefits. But those are generally a fairly small share of state budgets, so I haven't explicitly pulled those out here. So now the main number I'd like you guys to take away from that is to get all together, we'd expect a fiscal shock of nearly $200 billion over the next 3 fiscal years. And this is for states alone as a result of this recession. Now, if you add local governments that are facing their own shortfalls and increased costs, that could be as high as $450 billion. So we're really talking huge numbers here that states are going to be struggling with for just years to come. Now, positively, federal stimulus that was passed earlier in the year will offset some of this shortfall, particularly through enhanced Medicaid funding. But only part of the shortfall, and we estimate less than half of this gap that state and local governments are facing. So there's really a lot of room there for the federal government to be able to provide some more direct aid to state and local governments, which would go a long way in shoring up the recovery. Next chart, please. So here you can see our breakdown of what these shortfalls look like across states across the country. This map particularly shows the 3-year shortfall represented as a percent of gross state product to try to normalize things between states. Now, some states particularly at risk are areas that rely heavily on tourism, areas like Hawaii or Nevada. Another major group that you can see highlighted in red here are energy states. Energy states generally tend to have some of the most volatile revenue streams. Those are usually hit pretty hard in recessions. And so you can see those are some of the ones under the biggest amount of stress. Okay, next slide, please. So what I've just presented in those tables, in that table of revenue and Medicaid shortfalls, as well as the map, is our baseline outlook. Now, like I said before, we also consider a downside scenario, and risks are rising, especially with the federal government failing to pass any new stimulus, that we're really moving from the baseline down potentially into closer to a downside scenario type of world. And so this graph here is a graph of GDP, right? So the blue line is baseline, and you get a nice, smooth, if slow, recovery, especially until we have that vaccine. But the green line is a potential downside scenario that we could face. And under this downside scenario, the recovery will really only begin in earnest in mid-2021. Now, this would have much more destructive fiscal impacts for state and local governments. Higher unemployment would push the Medicaid rail still higher, and smaller incomes will limit sales and income tax collections. Okay, last slide, please. things. So if this downside materializes, it would create really unprecedented stress on state budgets. This chart is the counterpart to the one I showed earlier, but it's for a severe scenario. And as this chart shows, that downside would create a combined fiscal shock for states of more than $300 billion, and that goes up to potentially $650 billion for including local governments. Now, although states came into this recession with just record high rainy day reserves, those will do relatively little in the face of such a massive shortfall. And if state and local governments are forced to grapple alone with shortfalls of this magnitude, or even those presented under the baseline, they'll need to slash payrolls and expenditures just for years to come to try to make up for those gaps. And this has pretty significant implications for other areas of the economy. It'll trickle down into limited infrastructure funding, school funding, funding for higher education, and this could potentially necessitate tax increases in some places. Okay, so to wrap all of this up, even in our baseline scenario, we're still looking, the recovery is going to be long, and it's pretty much going to be a slow one until we can get a vaccine distributed. Because of how unusual this recession is, though, the labor market is still expected to recover much more quickly than it did following the Great Recession. And although we'll have to keep grappling with the virus, at least until we can get a vaccine, we're not going to be hampered by those same imbalances that really slowed down the recovery during the last decade. Things like the housing crisis and some of these credit problems that the economy was facing. There isn't just that underlying imbalance now. It's really external. There's a pandemic and that's shut things down. So hopefully after we can get that solved, assuming that the federal government and state governments are able to help businesses enough that they don't close and have a harder time reopening, we should be able to get a faster recovery. And greater support from the federal government, like I said, is going to be really key to keeping this recovery on track. And this isn't just the case for state and local governments, but also through providing direct aid to consumers to support spending and just keeping money flowing through the economy. And even in direct aid to industries that have been temporarily shut down by the pandemic. Okay, now I'm happy to take any questions. I believe we have 10 minutes for them. Weston?
Thanks, Emily. Really great content here. We really appreciate you joining us today and giving us this perspective. As for those of you who might not know me, I assume many of you do, my name's Austin Davis. I'm the Government Affairs Manager at the Lake Champlain Regional Chamber of Commerce, and really grateful that we got some of this national perspective and outlook hot off the press from analytics today. I guess, Emily, we'll just build off of the last topic that you had, and just kind of talk about what are we expecting to see as shifts in the labor market moving forward. You said that it won't be like the last recession and its outcomes.
Yeah, so we're looking for a faster recovery, which is, I'm sure, really welcome to news after the perhaps 10 years it took to get us back from the Great Recession. I think some of the interesting things to look out for are going to be any types of geographic shifts in, say, where activity is happening in the country throughout this recovery. It's going to be really interesting to see now that businesses have mostly successfully been able to operate with people working from home, whether that has any repercussions in terms of, first and foremost, where businesses might choose to set up shop. For example, perhaps a business doesn't need to be stuck in really expensive New York or San Francisco real estate. Maybe they think that some of the really well-educated populations, skilled populations in other places could be a good match for them at potentially lower business costs. So it'll be interesting to see whether this directs more activity to places like, say, Austin or Raleigh or Denver, some of those lower cost but up and coming hubs. Then the other thing that I think this could be interested for, and similar concept, is whether this accelerates that shift to remote work. And I think this particularly would be something that's of interest to Vermont as a state. I know even just like in my company, people have taken the pandemic as an opportunity to permanently change where they work, maybe work further away from the office, people not come in as much. And so this will be particularly important for maybe some of those places that people want to work, places that are attractive for people to live, and not just from like a lots to see or do there, but potentially places with better weather, better scenery, somewhere where lower housing costs, for example, whether we get a shift in people moving to some of these other locations because companies have realized that, it's fine, let's keep our employees happy, we can still get our work done.
That's fantastic to hear, because from a Vermont perspective, we certainly have that quality of life to offer. We've got a very educated workforce, and we're working on building out our broadband. I'll talk about that later. And we're very close to these major East Coast economic hubs where individuals could find themselves getting into there. So that's really fascinating to hear and to consider as we move forward. We had another question come through the chat about if additional federal relief isn't passed until February, what will the economy look like?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I'm sure that's on all of our minds right now. I think we are going to see some more job losses. Potentially, you can see that the recovery has slowed a bit over the past couple months. We've definitely seen lower job numbers, although we've kept adding jobs. I think those could potentially reverse a bit through the end of the year. We could see economic activity actually pull back. We do think that it'll be enough to avoid a double dip recession if we get some good stimulus money flowing through the economy at the start of next year. Consumers especially, have been able to rack up some good savings based on the money that was flowing through previously. And so hopefully that money will be able to keep them through a little bit until we can get some more money flowing out there. But definitely look for conditions to deteriorate a bit over the next couple months.
I guess a question would be, you do a lot of work with states like Vermont that are rather tourism dependent, and strict travel restrictions, and then consumer confidence, the likelihood that individuals, a lot of folks who are useful, who participate in the tourism market are in the at-risk age demographics for COVID-19. What do you see? I mean, if we're looking at a full return to normal in FY22 or FY23 or beyond, how would you say that these tourism dependent states should weather this crisis? Solve everything.
I'd love to. I'd really love to. I mean, I think different types of tourism-centered economies are definitely going to be able to fare better than others. I think somewhere like Vermont, potentially. I mean, what you say about the age groups is definitely relevant, but a place that focuses more on outdoor type activities, for example, like I'd love to be on a ski hill right now. I feel like I'd feel pretty safe about that. So some areas will definitely be able to at least muddle through for a while. I think your places more in trouble are areas that you need to get on an airplane to go to, like somewhere like Hawaii. People are going to be kept away from that, or potentially more urban areas. Like I don't see people wanting to take a trip to New York exactly at the moment. But potentially outdoor activities could fare a little better. I'm sure you have a much better sense of on the ground how this has been going for Vermont.
Certainly. I guess the one last question one question I have as I wait for others to come through the chat, that is front of my mind is, have you seen other states kind of using this crisis as an opportunity, if you will, to maybe double down on infrastructure or needs that they've had before the crisis that are more apparent now, and using federal funds? I mean, I know that there's a track record of cities and states in the U.S. coming out of natural disasters, for example, with some infrastructure investments they otherwise might not have done.
Well, I think that states, one of the troubles states have faced to be able to focus on some of these other areas is that a lot of the federal funds that have come towards states up till now have been earmarked specifically to be spent on coronavirus related expenses. And so that limits their flexibility in what they can do with this money. I mean, at the end of the day, money is ultimately fungible, but considering a lot of the revenue shortfalls they're also facing, they don't have a huge amount of flexibility there to try to invest in some other areas. That's why some additional funding without potentially some of these restrictions will let states, really make these decisions for themselves, what can best invest in their economies, invest in a recovery for themselves.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we are out of questions. Thank you so much. Again, really appreciate your time today and this great national perspective that you bring. You have anything you'd like to close with, or any final thoughts?
No, I feel like we've covered things pretty well here. Thank you so much for having me on this call with you today. It's great to be able to talk to you guys.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye.
So at this part of the presentation, we're going to kind of move it into a more of a central Vermont-centered type of a view. And in doing so, what we're looking to do here is kind of give you some perspective of what different events that you see happen over the next month or so will mean for Vermont. This year has been a year filled with uncertainty, and there's a whole lot of uncertainty left about the next few months. And, I would be rather skeptical if anybody told me they know how things would go. I think, as you just heard, there was a lot of discussion and assumption that we would see a federal aid package. And since, that's been walked back to the point where, as you heard, Moody's last night actually took that out of their modeling. So we're not looking to kind of predict or, handicap or anything of that nature. We're just looking to give you some of the kind of perspectives so that as you see events happen over the next few months, you can have a better sense of, I saw that, and that means it could have this impact on Vermont. And I think, excuse me, the biggest elephant in the room in all this, again, is the stimulus negotiations. As you heard Senator Leahy and Congressman Peter Welch say early on in our presentation, the House the Democratic-controlled House has sent over 2 aid packages since May to the GOP-controlled Senate, and they haven't gone anywhere. And the negotiations have primarily been between Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, and Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. And one of the things that's kind of important to point out that those two are the main folks at the negotiating table is that conspicuously absent has been the Senate Majority Leader McConnell, which means that as this is moved, it's getting to its final stages of negotiation, and it lacks some of the GOP Senate caucus support. So the Democrats sent over a $3.4 trillion offer called HEROES. They later sent another version called, kind of referred to as HEROES 2.0, which is about $2.2 trillion. And the Republicans have kind of countered first with, $1 trillion, then following by 1.6, and now they're up to about 1.8. This whole time, as was said earlier, the federal chair, the chair of the Fed, Jay Powell, has been, from the sideline kind of cheering for more legislative action to kind of buoy the economy. And then throughout all this, President Trump has been throwing curveballs and making things a little bit less predictable. Everything from last week, tweeting that he wants to walk away from the negotiating table, which sent the markets tanking overnight, to saying that he would like to see a package bigger than what the Democrats even offered. So, as he is 21 days away from election, he really wants to see a package. And ironically, the biggest barrier for him now is the Senate Republican caucus, which is not on board. And the big sticking point between the Democrats and the Republicans in this negotiation is really this state and local relief. And as you just heard, that it's going to be a very necessary component. And you're going to see some numbers on the next slide that actually kind of link really closely into what Moody's is projecting in terms of relief. As they continue this discussion, there's a level of, there's kind of a natural deadline kind of built in where we could see some action by around December 11th, as a continuing resolution will be needed to fund the government and avoid shutdown moving forward then. However, it's not certain that it happened then as well, and we could be looking towards even a February outcome. Obviously, the assumption is if the national elections pan out in which the Democrats take the White House and possibly even the Senate, there would be more relief coming, as blue states are the ones calling for it the most. So the deal as of now looks about a $1.8 trillion deal, and there's $300 billion for state and local governments. Speaker Pelosi, however, is looking really towards about a $436 million or a billion, dollar disagreement. And as you kind of heard in our earlier presentation from Moody's, that's about the amount that's being projected that states will need to weather this storm. There's also, the Republicans have come forward with a $400 per week enhanced federal unemployment benefit to go through to January in this deal. And as you heard earlier, this is an important component. The Democrats would rather have that go to 6. However, any amount of additional unemployment relief really does have impacts in the economy on consumer sentiment, consumer confidence, consumer spending, and the overall disposable income. The package also, as of now, kind of contains $60 billion for rental and mortgage assistance, $25 billion for childcare. Pelosi's pushing for $57 billion, which would be another very important component for Vermont, as we've moved into a hybrid school model, and that's required a lot of new pragmatic childcare options to help parents who have their children in school for a few days a week and not in others. There's also $45 billion for testing. Dems would like to see that at $75 billion. And there's some disagreements over structure. $28 billion for student loan relief, $15 billion for food assistance. And then there's agreement for another round of stimulus checks. However, the details have not been ironed out, and there's talk of instead of a $500 amount as previously done for per child, instead of a child tax credit. So, all of these components are in flux. These are still under negotiation, and we might not see a deal anytime soon. However, it's safe to say that these are kind of these sticking points, and these things that folks have been at the negotiating table for a long time about will be present in whatever final relief happens. And political outcomes of the next few months will definitely push the negotiations one way or another. And as said, Vermont has received a fair amount of CRF, more so than other states, thanks to our congressional delegations, our advocacy for small state minimums, and the need really for small states. Just because a state's smaller doesn't mean that the government infrastructure and the cost of mobilization to deal with a crisis like this is much smaller, as we see in all sorts of things across state government, including IT projects, for example. So we received $1.25 billion CRF funding. We were fortunate enough to see $238 million of that go to businesses and nonprofits as economic recovery grants. Really thankful to the Vermont legislature for doing that. That is an important component. As we discussed earlier, Vermont is such a tourism and hospitality dependent state. And the cost of an economic consequence of doing what it takes to sidestep the worst of the pandemic and keep our case rate as low as it has really been to burden those businesses and ask them to close their doors. So it only made sense to, compensate them for that diminished capacity, or in some cases, just flat out temporary closure. We've also seen a significant amount of money go to farms, to our schools, to mitigate the health and make sure that we can get our children back into in-person learning to some degree, healthcare stabilization. And some of the more exciting things are the increases in money for housing and childcare, which has really been turned around to the credit of the Agency of Commerce Community Development very quickly, and will actually be it represents some investments that will have long-term impacts on our states and this type of infrastructure for our state, whether that be revitalizing homes for using CARES dollars. So we have very old housing stock in our state, taking some of that blighted housing stock in our downtowns, renovating it and putting families in it who would otherwise be homeless during the pandemic, and standing up childcare hubs that might have use beyond this. It's worth noting that all of this took a fair amount of time, and it might take a fair amount of time again, depending on what the economic package looks like. There was a lot of Treasury restrictions on how these dollars could be used, and that was actually changing and coming out in iterations, and it took a lot of time for our legislature to, at times, it was hurry up and wait. So our legislature had to wait. They could look at the money, they could theorize what they wanted to do with the money. However, they needed the lawyers to really tell them what they could do with it. So the hope would be that any restrictions on these dollars is close and similar to what happened under CARES, and we can just kind of plug and play, put these any new dollars into existing programs that we've created to deal with the crisis, kind of re-up those programs, make some tweaks with the lessons learned, and then move forward. And finally, one last thing to just note that's important is Vermont businesses also received about $1.2 billion in Paycheck Protection Program loans. And this has been a fantastic assistance to Vermont. However, it wasn't necessarily a good fit for every business. However, a lot of those loans were very small, and recent guidance from the Treasury and SBA will make it easier for some of those to be forgiven. And we hope that we can move that threshold. We can see that threshold move from 50,000 up to 150,000 and sometime soon, which would cover the majority of Vermont PPP loans. So all of this kind of trickles down to in the back end side of the downstream impact of all this economic activity is state level budget pressures. And you just heard about a lot of it. And while the education fund revenues are a little bit more opaque right now, what's expected in the general fund revenue forecast is anywhere from a 95 to $115 million shortfall. And that'll be one of the biggest barriers going into the legislative session, as the legislature has to kind of deal with the normal growth that happens in a budget in any given year, which can be upwards of $35 million to $45 million because of things like inflation, the Pay Act, and and other items. There's also going to be a bit of a whiplash effect as items that were paid for with CARES Act and federal dollars that had to do with public safety, or expenses that didn't happen because the state was really, at the beginning of the crisis, shut down. Those kind of dissipate and come back in the next year budget. And then there's also, and then on top of that, as I already said, there's the COVID and revenue shortfalls from things like rooms and meals tax, personal income tax, sales and use tax that we should expect. So it'll set next year's legislature up for a really difficult year right out of the gate. And if we don't have federal relief in the next few months, if it doesn't come till February, it'll be even more difficult as the legislature will have to come back and start kind of building a potential budget without knowing how to close it and possibly expecting federal relief. The bottom line is we'll need more federal relief. The HEROES 1.0 would have been about a $1.5 billion allocation for Vermont. HEROES 2.0 would have meant probably about 500 million, a little bit smaller, plus some dollars flowing through federal programs. And this federal relief, could help plug budget gaps if it's loose on its restrictions. It could also represent, as I said earlier, an avenue forward on longstanding problems in the state, such as childcare, broadband, and temporary or affordable housing options. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So, we already kind of covered the budget pressures that the legislature will need to deal with when they come back in January. However, they'll also need to, probably get moving very quickly on another round of economic recovery grants. As Emily noted, as we head into the winter months, we're going to see, probably an uptick in cases, a slight downturn in economic activity, and it's going to be harder for our tourism and hospitality industries to actually do business. There also will be a few months past the last round of economic recovery grants that businesses had seen. If we want to keep them afloat throughout this, there will need to be a need. Hopefully, as I said before, we'll have some level of federal aid that will come in, and we can kind of just plug it into existing grant infrastructure that ACCD and Department of Taxes have created, and use the lessons learned to put that out to folks who demonstrate need. They'll also have to really quickly, and this is something I'll get into in the next slide, go to work on the Unemployment Trust Fund, as there'll be some fund solvency issues and experience rating issues. Additionally, this crisis has shown the need for expansion of broadband for both work and education, as folks are trying to do their best to physically distance from others. And then childcare infrastructure, which we were able to spend at least 50 million in over the course of this and maintain some of that infrastructure. However, now even more challenges are arriving, including even a lack of people using the spaces and things, good problems to have, but problems nonetheless. A couple more things, tourism marketing dollars. Vermont really, this is something that the Lake Chamber was working on before the pandemic and the subsequent economic downturn. However, it's something that we'll want to be working on through to the future. During this crisis, we've had to tell a lot of people to not come to Vermont. And we've seen other tourism markets in our drive market even advertising heavily and pulling people in. And Vermont's been in a state of neglecting to some extent its tourism marketing efforts and has been living off the interest of great branding and even just opportunities of chance from the past. And we really need to make that investment in marketing ourselves as a tourism destination, which has downstream impacts of recruitment of our workforce to the state as well. So, whatever federal relief we have, we should really think about doing some of the things to build that brand, using some of those dollars in a way that helps deal with the crisis, but also has a long-term and outlook on how the Vermont brand can be helped. Finally, two more things. Our pension liability in our state, the unfunded liability is continually been an issue over the last few years as we kind of pay down the liability that came from decisions of earlier legislatures. Not going to be anywhere up of $120 million. It's only been made worse due to this economic crisis with everything that happened in markets and whatnot, and the liability has increased even more so, and that might be something the legislature might need to address. Finally, it's worth noting, because you're probably hearing a lot of national attention about it. However, potentially the current Supreme Court nomination process might tip the court in a way that would be more conservative and might rule to overturn the Affordable Care Act. There's currently a suit making its way up to, or in the process of making its way to the Supreme Court, which will happen soon, from 16 states about the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. And no matter what you think or how you feel about the Affordable Care Act, an overturn of ACA would mean that about 20,000 Vermonters would lose their insurance or have some significant type of change in how they're insured. And the state would be waylaid in its long-term work on the all-payer waiver. And that will create a great deal of new turbulence in an already turbulent time. So that's just something to kind of keep in the back of your head as you look forward and as you see the Supreme Court nomination process go forward, which our own Senator Leahy is intimately involved in. So I just want to talk real quick about the Unemployment Trust Fund, because this is a very, very important issue, and it's one that could be easy to overlook. It's also one that the Vermont legislature will have to get to work on straight away as they come into the legislative session. The rates for unemployment tax collection are set in July, or are issued in July. They're set and worked on far earlier. And for that reason, really the legislature will have to make some kind of decision on this issue by mid-February, certainly before March. And before COVID-19, the Vermont UI Trust Fund was one of the healthiest in the country. It had about almost over 500 million in it, and since then it's been depleted to about 300 million, represents about 40%. And the system is designed for self-correction. So without any legislative action, the UI tax rate actually, as of now, will go from Schedule 1 to Schedule 5, and that could represent anywhere almost a tripling of some rates for employers. Certainly a difficult cost burden to add on to employers while they might be shut down or operating at 25 or 50% capacity. So there was a proposal brought forward by the administration and passed by the House, and the House Commerce Committee did fantastic work on this, that would have prevented a rate jump by any more than 2 schedules in a given calendar year, with some allotment for in case the fund really faced solvency issues. But it would have prevented a Schedule 5 rate schedule in July and limit it to a Schedule 3, which the Department of Labor projected could still keep the fund solvent and safe. And that did not make its way through the Senate, and we're hoping and we're expecting that will be brought up really in short order as soon as the session starts, to give the Department of Labor to implement those rate schedules and give employers some opportunity to understand it as it comes down. There's also some issues with experience ratings that we're hearing about, as employers have been charged have charges to their account that wouldn't go through in normal times. However, due to the waiver of things like penalty weeks and work search requirements and others have happened. And if you have those issues at all, you should contact us at advocacy@vermont.org. We're currently in the process of working through some of those issues. So aside from those items, there's some items that might take center stage, and they're worth noting. However, who knows what can happen between now and then. And some of this will be the byproduct of how the legislative races and the gubernatorial race in this state turns out. And one that you might have heard a little bit about in the campaign trail, be it a virtual campaign trail, is an increased income tax. There's a proposal. It's found actually its way into different places. One gubernatorial candidate is proposed it. Also was discussed at the Burlington city level, and it was introduced earlier this last biennium by a senator as part of a Green New Deal. But it's a tax on middle class or upper middle class filers making more than 159,000. It'd be about 1.6%, with a little bit more for folks over 500,000, I believe it's a 0.15%. And that's expected to bring in about $100 million. That's a large chunk of money, and it's in touch with some of the political rhetoric we've heard over the last few years. So as legislators try to make difficult decisions, expect that this might be something that comes up in conversation consistently. We also expect a tax on pre-written software accessed remotely to be another topic of discussion. It was brought up really late in this last special session, and the members of the House Ways and Means Committee have been insistent that this is something that needs to be implemented in Vermont over the past couple of years, and it's faced very strong pushback in the Senate. So we expect that dialogue to continue in the coming session. There's also been a proposal and chatter about closing pandemic shortfalls with a short-term sales tax surcharge. The number floated was about 1%. And some folks, on this webinar might remember a time when the sales tax was actually supposed to be only temporary. And so you could understand why some people would get a little nervous. And then there's the typical items that we've mentioned in advocacy newsletters time and again around the cloud tax, the luxury clothing tax, taxes on candy. And then there's continued discussion and among legislators about the idea of broadening the sales tax base by bringing in some services, which is something that might look tempting to members of money committees who are concerned about budget shortfalls coming into the session. Aside from that, there's some items that will likely reappear. We kind of see them consistently. Act 250 fell short this last biennium, I think by anyone's standards. We started the session, the last biennium, with a large proposal that came out of an Act 250 commission that was aimed at modernizing it. We ended the session with a roughly 10-page bill that only worked on trails and forest fragmentation. Fell very short of modernizing, and even by the Democratic discussion narrative of a balanced bill, really did fall short there. So we'll think that everyone will want to come back and start from square one again on that in the coming biennium. That's very certain. One thing that we're not sure about, and it could come back, it likely will at some level, is a paid family and medical leave proposal. It's been a talking point on the campaign trail. It passed the legislature this last year, as you might remember. However, despite having a super majority, the Democrats were not able to override the governor's veto of the proposal. He pushed for a voluntary program. However, that voluntary program was significantly waylaid, as you'd expect, by this crisis. That at the version passed would have been upwards of a $30 million tax, possibly more, and would certainly be an issue if the legislature were to try to levy that tax with all the other issues coming down the pike and the revenue shortfalls we have. Quickly, a couple more things. Medical monitoring language. The Senate was unable to override a governor's veto of a bill that created medical monitoring language. The bill actually became, as the biennium moved on, kind of non-essential as a federal court decision. Actually created medical monitoring as a remedy in Vermont. However, it seems that some members of the legislature would like to go further than the current case law. And this couldn't get through the Senate. However, some of the races that are in contention currently in Vermont are in districts that were key votes that held the line on this subject matter this past biennium. So keep an eye on those races, and if this affects you, definitely reach out to our advocacy team. Two more things. Minimum wage. There was a bill that passed this year, as you probably have seen, and it'll actually go into effect in January. We'll start to see a minimum wage rate increase. I believe the 5th time we've changed the minimum wage in the last 20 years. It was supposed to be a 5-year bill, and what got across the finish line was a 2-year bill that kind of puts it on the trajectory that the Senate looked towards at a $15 minimum wage by 2024. And we would expect that in the latter half of the biennium that there might be another bill, as well as some earlier discussion around things such as the tip minimum wage and wage and hour laws. And finally, single-use plastic and extended product responsibility is something that the Senate has shown a keen interest in, despite the pandemic. And if you kind of wonder that if they would not do this kind of activity while also facing all the other issues, I'd suggest looking back at floor discussion about S220, which is a bill that, among other things, would have banned small single-use plastic shampoo bottles in lodging. And, the discussion ranged around how even though lodging was shut down, that this is something that needs to be done and it has been delayed on. So it's likely that they'll pick right up where they left off on that legislation in the next session. So in conclusion, and then I'll answer some whatever questions might be added into the chat, plus a few that were submitted beforehand. We'll really know a lot more in 22 plus days as the elections happen. There'd be two vastly different tax outlooks depending on the gubernatorial race. The makeup of the General Assembly could dramatically change if the Democrats aren't able to keep their veto-proof majority or add to it. The timing of federal aid will be everything. How much federal aid will be everything, and it's all a matter of just waiting on Washington. I think that Vermont has prided itself on being a leader, and I think that we consistently, see ourselves as a leader. However, this crisis has really showed how much Vermont is dependent on the federal aid and really is swayed by national trends. So we'll look forward to seeing how that happens. And hopefully we gave you some context today to understand how things as they happen at the federal level, how they impact Vermont. And one last thing to kind of summarize, over the last few years, the Vermont legislature has looked at a lot of proposals that the LCC has said, really are things we think should be done at a regional or national level, and a potential we're just seeing how that happens, and hopefully we keep some context today to understand what a sweep of Washington by the Democrats would mean that some of those issues would be taken up at the federal level and discussed. So we'll look forward to potentially seeing that. We want to hear from you between now and then. So please email us, advocacy@vermont.org. Read our biennium update that we just put out a few weeks ago, and make sure you're signed up for our advocacy newsletter if you're not already. We want to hear from you, our members, and we want to understand what you need most and how you feel about these things as they come forward. So with that, I think I will move to questions if folks have them. And I have one that was submitted last night, which I think is to some extent is a interesting question that talks about the potential for federal relief and implications of federal relief, and is a really far-reaching outlook. And that came from Orion Bren, and he asked, what is the chance of a national infrastructure bill? How can funding for infrastructure be consistent and better prioritized? And I think the reason why I thought this was a really interesting question was it is something that administration after administration has looked towards, and we've heard both sides of the aisle mention federal relief over the years, and federal infrastructure bills over the years without any kind of progress on such a bill. And I think that while this would be something that would certainly help our economy, I think that the COVID relief will obviously be a very large lift, could serve some infrastructure needs, as I said earlier. However, the interesting thing will be if the Democrats, for example, take DC and control the West Wing and the Senate, as in addition to the House they have now, we might see some kind of deficit hawk activity even coming from them. Sometimes, once we get through a couple $1 trillion aid packages, everyone starts to look more like a deficit hawk. Despite that, so Biden, presidential candidate Joe Biden has suggested a $2 trillion aid package. However, that aid package or $2 trillion green infrastructure package will likely face some trouble after COVID packages get through. So got a question in the chat. We're hearing a lot about urban migrants making their way to Vermont. Is there any early data on their economic impact? In short, data is a little sparse. Things are, as was said, anecdotal. And however, what we can say is we've seen some uptick in school enrollment over the last few years. I mean, over the last couple months as school starts, and some folks have made this their temporary home at the least. I think a big thing that we might want to do with our whatever federal relief, whatever economic relief we get, would be to look at using that relief to keep some of those individuals in Vermont, or provide opportunities that would make them want to stay in Vermont. As we said earlier, the labor economy will change, and you might not need to be in a big city such as Boston, New York, or a more urban center like some of those in Connecticut. However, you might want to be close to them because that's where your company is located. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities for Vermonters to think about bringing in satellite operations or better facilitating remote workers from these areas who want the quality of life that Vermont has, either because they're currently still in those urban centers and they're getting tired of them as they are paying more for a crowded urban apartment when they would like to live out in the Vermont countryside, or they're already here enjoying the Vermont lifestyle and they want to find a way to make that permanent. We really should be doing that as creating opportunities for individuals to stay and work here, as well as potentially trying to build more anchor employers as part of our economic strategy as we go forward in the next few years. Just looking to see if there's any more questions there. Okay. Not seeing any more questions, so I'll just wrap up by saying thank you everyone for coming to this. It was a disappointment as always to cancel this legislative breakfast back in March. However, looking back, certainly our abundance of caution was certainly warranted, and we're really thankful for New England Federal Credit Union for sponsoring this series and sticking with us through this crisis as a sponsor. We're thankful for Costco, who's going to actually host this event in person, for providing the sponsorship for gift cards to Burlington areas breakfast establishments, so that you can still have your virtual breakfast. And we're thankful for all of our members who are working with us, engaging with us, paying dues, and keeping our community safe, and keeping our community the way we love it. This has certainly been a hard time for everybody, and we just appreciate effort on every level, right up from our congressional delegation, which has been fantastic, is on weekly calls with us to help us keep us apprised of what's going on in DC, right down to each member who's making ends meet on their own and still going out of their way to send encouragement to our team and checking with our team and pushing us on policy directions. we're so appreciative of everybody. So with that, just one more reminder, email us at advocacyvermont.org or austin@vermont.org with your questions, comments, concerns as we build our agenda for the upcoming legislative session. Read our biennium update if you haven't already, and make sure you're signed up for our advocacy newsletter. And if you want to get more involved in our advocacy efforts, please reach out. We really do rely on the perspective of our members, our business owners, and we're always listening. So thank you so much, everybody, and I hope you have a great Tuesday.